Hello and welcome to this week's IG Live. Today I have the pleasure of talking to Nicole Panteleakos. Many of you know her from her middle grade novel, Planet Earth is Blue, an acclaimed book which actually, has as its protagonist an autistic, nonverbal girl, which is something very unusual and very much needed in children's literature. Hello.
Hi,
Hi. Hi, good to see you. Thank you for joining us today.
thank you.
You. And so I was just talking a little bit about your book, but before we get into that, maybe you could introduce yourself and tell us what your journey was to becoming an author, if that was something you always wanted to do.
Sure. My name is Nicole, and I wanted to be an author since I was really little. I wrote my first novel in the first grade, and it was called Kindergarten Chaos. And I wrote it because I felt like there weren't enough chapter books without pictures being written for kindergarten students. And now that I'm an adult, I look back and understand why. But at the age of 6, I thought that was a terrible injustice.
I love that you are already looking for gaps and seeing how you could fill them.
Yes. But it turns out nobody really wanted that except me. So
Well, and so later, as you got older, what was it like to actually start writing books? Was this something? Did you dive in right away? Did you wonder, how that would look?
I wrote a bit of everything. So up through middle school, I was still really into writing books. And then I got into high school and I joined the school paper. So I got really into journalism and I thought maybe I would be like a war correspondent and go to places and write from the front lines. But then, as it turns out, I don't like to fly and I'm a big chicken. So that did not work out at all. And then I got into college and I switched from journalism to playwriting my first year. So then I spent 4 years focused on writing plays, and that ended up becoming my major. So I did that for a few years. And then after I had graduated, maybe 4 years or so after I had graduated college, I saw that an author I liked was teaching a class at my former college in writing for children. And I was like, oh, would be a really neat opportunity to meet this writer who wrote a book that I like. So I signed up and plus I'm a perpetual student. I love taking classes.
Right.
So I signed up, I took the class, I loved it. She recommended me for a graduate program for an MFA in children's literature. So I applied and got into that. And then I sort of went full circle and went back to writing for kids again.
Wow, that's amazing. And now we have, it's interesting to talk about writing plays versus writing. I'm sure we could get into that, well, like kind of what the differences are between that form and this one, but I want to make sure we get to talk about Planet Earth is Blue, your middle grade novel, which earned 3-star reviews from Kirkus Book List and School Library Journal, and is a Parents' Choice Foundation Gold Award winner, among many other honors. So tell us about the book and what was your inspiration behind it?
When I started working on it, I knew I wanted to write about the Challenger. As a kid, I was like weirdly obsessed with bad news and bad weather and things like that. So I was really interested in the Challenger. And originally, I was going to write about a character obsessed with the Challenger disaster. But it didn't go very far and it just didn't feel right. So when I shifted focus, I decided to write about someone excited for the Challenger launch. And I knew I wanted the character to be autistic. I knew I wanted a girl. At the time, there was very little autistic girl representation in middle grade. There's tons more now, which I think is amazing. But when I first started writing it, there were only a couple of examples, a couple of books that were out. And so I kind of combined those wants into this book.
Well, I have to ask, do you remember the challenge? I think you're younger than I am, so I wonder, you don't remember it, do you?
So I first learned about the
Yeah.
Challenger from an episode of Punky Brewster when I was
Oh,
probably 5 or 6,
I love that.
and I was so floored. And we didn't have TV that was running all the time. If you remember, there's no
Right.
and not everything was on DVD, and there was no streaming. So I just remembered part of that episode for my whole childhood and into adulthood. And I finally got to see it again after the book had already come out. I found the first like group of I don't even know if it was the first season or what, but it was Punky Brewster on DVD, and finally got to see it again. But I became obsessed with it because of that episode of that show.
That's interesting. Because you go into this in your author's note, but I was a little younger than the main character in your book, the Nova, when it happened. But I still remember not so much the launch itself as afterwards. For some reason, in my school they didn't show it. But as you say, there were so many kids that watched it live, expecting
Yeah.
to see this launch. And so the whole time I'm reading this book, and Nova's so excited about the launch, and I know what's coming. It's like this impending doom that it's on the horizon. But anyway, so we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But to go back to when you were talking just about how you conceived of this character, Nova, who is so wonderful, not just that she's autistic and she's a girl, which, as you said, was revolutionary enough, but also that she's nonverbal. So, how does your book kind of break down stereotypes that I think a lot of people have about autistic kids, but especially ones that are nonverbal?
I really wanted her to be a non-speaking character, a nonverbal character, for a number of reasons. But one is that I worked with and cared for a number of kids on the autism spectrum, including a number of kids who were non-speaking or nonverbal or had some communication skills that were verbal but mostly communicated in a different way. And what played over again a lot in my head when I was creating her was when I worked in preschool many years ago. I worked in a special education like hybrid school classroom. And we had an expert who came in one day, and she was trying to teach me how to work with this one little boy who is one of my godchildren, and who I worked with at school and took care of after school. And so I spent a lot of time with him every day. And she told me at one point that I was speaking to him with too many words, that I could only speak in 1 or 2 words at a time. Everything should be in a sing-song. And she goes, he doesn't speak because he doesn't understand. And I remember thinking, even at like 21 or whatever I was, I'm like, that's ridiculous. Of course he understands. When we're home, I speak to him in full sentences. He cooks his own lunch. We play games. Like he's a smart boy, but he had severe apraxia of speech.
Mm-hmm.
And around the same time, my grandmother, who I love very much and was a big inspiration for me, and also did some writing. She was losing her speech to vascular dementia. I couldn't remember the word for a second there, to vascular dementia. And I could see how hard she tried to communicate, and people treated her the same way, including the speech therapist through the nursing home. And it was this idea of, well, if you're not speaking, then you're not thinking. And I knew that was wrong, and it really bothered me. So I wanted to show not just kids, but their teachers, their parents, any adult who might read that book, that just because someone is not communicating verbally doesn't mean that there's not a lot going on in their inner world.
Right, which really comes through in this book, especially because you have it set, what is that, 40 years ago in 1986. And I mean, as much as we still have a lot more to do as far as our understanding of autism, but wow, it has really changed a lot since 1986. When you were researching it, because you, as I mentioned, your author's note, you kind of go into that a little bit, but what was there something that really surprised you, or that you wanted to make sure that you highlighted in the book about how much our understanding of autism has changed?
Yes, so much. I did make Nova's situation a little bit idealized in that she was attending a public school with a special education, in like they had their own program, but then she was included in certain classes in the typical classroom. That really came about later, but I did talk to multiple people, BCBA, and more than one special education teacher who taught at that time, because I wanted to make sure it wouldn't be completely unbelievable. And I was told it wouldn't be completely unbelievable, but the idea that a character like her would have gotten that support in education at that time is a little less, it stretches the suspension of disbelief just a little bit there, but it was not impossible. At the time, it's a lot more likely she would have been in a secluded room or secluded program, as opposed to those opportunities for inclusion, like when she goes to the astronomy class,
Right.
and the baking class and the things that she really enjoys. Whereas today, depending upon the school and the kid and the IEP or 504 plan, they're more likely to spend most of the day in the non-special education classroom. So there's been a huge shift in terms of that.
Yeah. What kind of response have you gotten from neurodiverse kids and their families about this book? About how many? I mean, because we kind of talked about how it's important for neurotypical students and adults reading this book, but what about the neurodiverse kids themselves, or maybe autistic kids? What kind of response have you gotten from them?
It's been really positive, and it's been wonderful. I know we're going to talk a little bit later about sensitivity readers, but as I was working on the book, I had multiple other people read it, including autistic tweens and teens, who either were at the time or had been previously nonverbal, non-speaking. And I had autistic adults read it before it even came out, because I wanted to make sure, I'm like, I can't just draw on my own experiences. I want to make sure there's not anything that I'm missing. So we could talk more about that later. But the response since it's come out has been so positive. And there was one school visit I did. I went back to the school where I attended like through third grade. And I visited a fourth grade classroom there, because they've now moved the fourth grade into the elementary school. And one of the boys whose teacher had read the book out loud to them, he said that he really loved it because he's autistic too. And Nova was the first character that reminded him of him. And I was so touched. And then another kid was like, "You're not autistic, you talk." And I was like, wait. And then their teacher, she was so sweet. She jumped in and they had like a little conversation about it. But I thought it was kind of interesting that this one child was like, "I see myself," and this other child was like, "Well, you're not exactly like Nova,
Right.
so I'm not buying it." So,
although that's kind of something you talk about, right? Is that back then, that like now we have much more appreciation of the spectrum of autism, and at the time maybe he wouldn't have been classified as autistic if he were back in Nova's day, because we kind of just had like one narrow view of what autism was, right?
It's so true. I have a great uncle. He passed away a couple of years ago, and as a little kid, he was diagnosed with a thyroid condition, and that was his diagnosis. But he had speech delay. He rocked. He stimmed. He was the only person I've ever known who had like a savant skill on TV. When they show autistic people, they tend to show like a savant skill. Right. But he had basically a calendar in his head, and he remembered every date of everything. We have hundreds of cousins. I have a very big family, and he knew everybody's birthday, death day, anniversary. He could tell you it was a Tuesday. But he had he had considerable struggles socially. He lived with his mother all his life. He couldn't really live independently. And it was finally when he was trying to remember what year it was. He was probably 70-ish, 72 maybe, when he was finally diagnosed with autism. And I was not shocked. He was shocked. And I was like, "Oh, I'm sorry, Uncle Mike. I'm pretty sure they're right. You're sort of like textbook autism," but they didn't know what to call it. He would now be in his 80s, so they didn't know what to call it when he was a little kid in kindergarten or whatever 75 years ago. So they said it was a thyroid issue. Meanwhile, there's nothing wrong with his thyroid. So I don't know where they got that.
It's so strange. I guess they were looking for something. Yeah. Well, so having a character like Nova, like you said, I mean, she understands so much, but still she's a kid and, autistic. What were the challenges or advantages of having her as the narrator? And I was just thinking, I know there were a few times when something would happen that maybe an adult would say or somebody else, and we as the reader kind of understand what's happening, and maybe she doesn't quite pick up on everything. So what was that like having her? Like, what did you kind of think about as you were having her as the narrator?
It helped a lot having the alternating bits where it's in the third person and it's removed, because that allowed me to show some of those things she wasn't maybe not grasping, or some of it too isn't even the autism. She's not, without ruining the ending, she's in denial for a good portion of the book. And so I needed another voice. I tried writing it all in her voice and it wasn't working. And I thought this is going to be exhausting for a reader to be in her head all the time and not seeing the bigger picture. So I wanted, kind of like how I wanted it to be a mirror and a window for neurodivergent and neurotypical kids, I wanted it to be really close where you see from in her head, and more removed where you get to see her from the outside, so you see her as outsiders see her. And I think that helped a lot. I think in general there's a lot that kids don't get, and I don't mean that as any sort of slam against kids, but we all, I mean, if even something as small as watching a movie that you watched all the time as a kid with your parents, and then you watch it as an adult and you see things in it and you're like, I can't believe I was allowed to watch this as a child. And then at least with boomer parents, they're like, whatever your head, you were fine. So I feel like it was really helpful to have those alternating perspectives to show the reader from both sides.
Although it's kind of funny that you say that, because also you use that quote from The Little Prince saying that adults don't get things and children are all constantly having to explain things to them, because there's also that element that she a lot of times picks up on things or has these insights that the parents are kind of clueless, or adults in her life are clueless, like the fact that she understands so much when a lot of times her teachers think she doesn't even know her alphabet, but she can actually read. There's so many things like that they don't pick up on. So it's kind of interesting.
Oh, sorry. One response I got from a friend of mine who has been a special education teacher for a long, long time, after she read the book, she told me it made her think differently about how she was teaching kids, especially with things like there's the part in the book where Nova has to, touch a triangle, touch red. That I don't know about now because I'm not in a classroom, but that was really big, maybe 15, 20 years ago. It was a lot of repetition, touch red, touch triangle. And I know with my little godson, the one I mentioned earlier, I would say to him, oh, I hated doing those things. And you'd have to see if he knew it. And I'd say, okay, touch red. And he'd hover his hand over red, look right at me and slap the yellow one and then just laugh because he thought he was very funny. And I'd say, you're never going to graduate beyond this. If I can't say that you pass. And he just thought that was the funniest thing. So I wanted to show with Nova that just because she's not showing that she understands doesn't mean she's not understanding. And so for that teacher that I respected, so much, to say it made her think differently. And that's sort of the children having to explain it, not that I'm a child, but having to explain it to the adults. So I guess that works in both directions too.
Yeah. And somebody that does really understand her a lot is her sister, Bridget. So, and they have such an amazing relationship, and so many ways, like she's like the consistent person in her life, and they go through foster care, and they've been through so many different schools. That's part of the problem with Nova, right? Is that she hasn't had consistent education. So every time she starts somewhere else, she has to go through all the testing again, and they don't really understand her. So how did you go about kind of thinking about and writing that really lovely relationship?
Bridget is the sister I always wanted. And no offense, I have a brother and I have 3 stepbrothers, and that's lovely. But as a kid, I always wanted a sister. And I used to try to make my brother be a sister. I'd dress him up. I had a different name for him. He was lovely, but it was just never the same. So I created Bridget to be the big sister that not only I wanted, but I feel like a lot of kids want, the idealized sibling. What I didn't realize I was doing in the process is I created a character who was very much a parentified child. And that has become something much more in the conversation, especially in terms of kids with trauma or kids in the foster system. It's very true that an older sibling or a more responsible seeming sibling or a more mature seeming sibling has a lot of that put on them. So when I wrote Bridget, I was looking at her like, oh, she's this wonderful, perfect, idealized big sister. And now looking back at it, I can also see, but that comes from trauma too. So she's also a character with a lot of trauma. But for Nova, from Nova's perspective, Bridget is just amazing. She's perfect. I have written multiple attempts at writing a book from Bridget's perspective that shows it all a bit differently, but I have not been able to finish it because I'm not quite sure where it goes. But I hear myself saying but a lot. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, no, that's fine. But it's interesting because, like you say, I think you kind of really comes through in the book that in a way, maybe not until kind of towards the end that you start thinking about things from Bridget's perspective and how in a lot of ways they're both been misunderstood or mistreated by going through the foster system. So what do you think? I mean, there are very specific things people can take away as far as autism or as far as the foster care system, but also just what do you want kids to take away in general about going through something really difficult and kind of surviving things that have happened to you?
The biggest thing I want them to take away from the story is a sense of hope. Um, when everything falls apart for Nova, again, like avoiding spoilers, but everything falls apart. And what do you do after everything falls apart? And that's a lot of what I wanted the book to be about. You have all this build up, but you also have all this, trauma coming in from behind, and everything comes together. And then, much like the Challenger, it launches and everything, in that case, literally falls apart. And how do you metaphorically pick up the pieces and move on after something so horrific like that has happened? And I really struggled with writing the ending of this book. I had written the beginning and I wrote an ending, and then I went back and wrote the middle, but I felt like the ending was too depressing. I was afraid that the whole book would be too depressing because the ending, I'm like, how can I make it anything but depressing when the challenge, I can't change what happened with the Challenger. Right. And a good friend of mine at the time said, well, if you can't make it happy, make it hopeful. And I was like, oh my goodness, I love that so much. So I went back and I reworked the ending and I kept that in mind. And I did. I just made it hopeful. And I hope that that's what kids would take away from it. There's a part at the end where Nova, I'm trying to think of how to say this without giving it away for someone who hasn't read it. But there's a part where Nova basically says, like, I go on, like all these terrible things have happened, and her mother is gone, and her father is still listed as missing in action in Vietnam, but we can assume that he's never coming back. And she's realizing that she can keep going and keep moving forward, even though the absolute worst has happened. And so I would hope that when kids read that, whether they're kids in foster care, whether they're kids struggling with family issues or friendship issues, or struggling with something external, like I was watching the news a lot as a kid. And if kids are watching the news right now, there's a lot of bad news, and it can be easy to get overwhelmed by that and feel like everything is very dark and very scary and there's no hope. And I hope that the ending shows kids that there is an after.
I love that. It's so beautiful. And I encourage people to read it because like we've said, there are like some very specific things that you can learn from it. But at the end, it is a really hopeful book. And I think, like I've talked about before, your author's note kind of goes into a little bit, even with the Challenger, there's some kind of hopeful things that you can take away from it that I think comes through in her story. I wanted to go back to what you were talking about the sensitivity readers. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I know you're a sensitivity reader. You worked on with sensitivity readers for this book. So how do you think the book benefited? Like, why do you recommend that people do that for their books?
I think not only for authenticity, but to make sure you haven't missed anything. So, for example, I had a part in toward the original ending of the book where Nova does speak something out loud and she's understood. And the way I had written it, a friend of mine who is on the autism spectrum but is unable to speak for a different reason, they had read it and they said to me, this could sound like, I'm trying to remember the phrase that they used, but basically, it's like a miracle ending, but where it's an ableist miracle ending. And they used a phrase that was really good at the time, and now I can't remember what it was. I'm sure it'll come to me. But basically, I didn't want it to sound like, okay, everything's great, she's cured now, she's going to start speaking. And I'm like, well, that's not what I intended. That's not what the ending is supposed to be. It's not supposed to be a happy ending because she said a word. And so I went back and I reworked that, and I didn't catch it, but I'm glad that my friend did, and it made the ending better for it. Miracle cure or something like that. So it's great to have other people looking and other people's experiences. So one of the sensitivity readers I had is a young woman. She was about 18 or 19 at the time she read the book. and she's autistic, and she was either non-speaking or considered like selectively mute. She had selective mutism through most of her childhood, and even as a young adult, her preferred method of communication wasn't conversation. So her mother would read a chapter out loud to her, and she would type responses to questions for me, and I found that invaluable. One of the parts that she was particularly interested in is where Nova gets really frustrated and has a meltdown. And I worried, I didn't want that to seem like a temper tantrum. And how do I write it in the 80s and not have it seem like a temper tantrum, where in the 80s they wouldn't have identified that as a sensory overload and a meltdown. So I'm like, I can't be genuine to the time period if I call it a sensory overload meltdown, but I want to show the reader that that's what it is. And she helped me with her feedback to make sure that that came through. So I hope it works for other people who read it who have had those kinds of experiences. I have my share of sensory issues, and I especially did as a kid, but just drawing on my own experience wasn't enough. I was really glad to have that feedback.
Amazing. Yeah, especially it seems especially for something like this where there is so much sensitivity and so much kind of challenging our like understanding of it of what it would be like to experience something like that. So well, thank you so much for taking time to talk with us. I want to give you a chance to shout out any upcoming projects that you're working on or that you might have on the horizon.
I'm working on a couple of things right now. I have a deadline today for a picture book that I'm contracted to write. So I'll be working on that later because it's not done. So I have that. And then I'm pivoting a bit and I'm working on a YA historical inspired by the experiences of my aunt. She was a 19-year-old nun when she was arrested by the Nazis and sent to a Nazi internment camp. Wow. And she spent the rest of, that was in 1940, and she spent the rest of the war as a prisoner of war. So I've been in possession of her diary for 20 years now, and I think it's time to write it so that other people know about those experiences. So something very different, except still historical.
Did you ever think if you hadn't had that, would you have thought of doing historical fiction otherwise? Like, is that something you've kind of been interested in anyway, or?
Historical fiction is my favorite. My master's thesis for when I was studying children's literature was set during the blizzard of '78 in Connecticut, which people still talk about the blizzard of '78. Wow. And I think people outside of New England don't realize what a big thing it was. There's ice cream named after it. People still have t-shirts that say, I survived the blizzard of '78. And then it was a big deal earlier this year where they got more snowfall in some areas than they did in the blizzard of '78. And New Englanders kind of lost their minds. So that's like a ghost story set. It's kids are trapped in a possibly haunted theater for 3 days with no adults during the blizzard of '78. So basically everything. I love the research aspect. I like talking to people who've been there whenever possible. I like reading diaries and stories and news articles and all of that. So while I won't say I'd never write something contemporary, I really prefer historical.
I love, well, just like this book. I mean, I hadn't really thought about it in terms of it being historical fiction, but I guess it is. I don't know. I guess I never thought about historical fiction as something that took place during my lifetime, but I guess I'm old enough that it is.
When I was working on it before it came out and they were talking about marketing, someone called it historical fiction. And even my editor, who I love so much, she said, well, it's not historical fiction, it's the '80s. And they were some of the people who were a little younger in the room were like, well, that's before I was born. And I think we were all a little horrified.
I love it. Oh, that's so fun. Well, it's such a great book. Again, we've been talking about Planet Earth is Blue. If you joined our conversation late, don't worry. It's going to be up on Instagram in just a few minutes. And then we'll also have it up on our YouTube channel. Nicole, thank you so much. This is so fun to talk with you.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thanks. And thanks to all of you for watching. We'll see you again next week. Bye, everybody.